This is a tutorial for equation solving. So on your equation solving review package, I'm going to go over basically the first page of examples, and then you will try some of the examples on the other pages. First off, one thing to be sure of is whenever you come across pi in the entire course, you want to use your pi button on your calculator. So see if you can find that instead of using 3.14. We're going to start by doing a review of two-step equations, which you learned in Math 9. So if I want to solve for x here in part A, the first thing you might want to do is build a wall down your equal sign so that you separate the two sides of your equation. Then the thing I want to think about in my head is, what is happening to x? Now, right now there's two things happening. It's being multiplied by 7 and it's being added by 4. We want to deal with the add subtract first, because whenever you're trying to isolate a variable, you want to always think of reverse BEDMAS. So since add and subtract is last in BEDMAS, you want to do it first in equation solving. So I got to think, what's the opposite of adding 4? The opposite of adding 4 is subtracting 4, so I do it to both sides of the equation. Here it cancels to 0. And here I end up with 21. So now I have 21 equals 7x. Then I think again, what's still happening to x? It's being multiplied by 7. What's the opposite of multiplying by 7? Dividing by 7. So I divide by 7 to both sides of the equation. These 7's cancel. 21 divided by 7 is 3. And so my final answer is that x equals 3. Now I could always check if I wanted by putting 3 in for x in my original equation and seeing if the two sides end up equaling each other. And in this case they do, so that helps me to guarantee that I have the right answer. We're going to try another one that's not on the front sheet. If you flip your page and go to the find a match puzzle and look at question 4, I thought I would do that question with you as another example. You may want to pause it here and try it first on your own. So the first thing I'm going to do is build my wall. Then I'm going to ask what's happening to x. It's being multiplied by -6 because when there's nothing in between, it's a multiply. And it's being subtracted by 11. I want to deal with my add subtract first. So the opposite of subtracting 11 is adding 11. So I do that to both sides. This becomes 0. So I still have -6x. And on this side, I have 60, 49 plus 11. Now I ask what's happening to x still. It's being multiplied by -6. The opposite is to divide both sides by -6, which cancels that. And now I have x equals -10. And that's my final answer. And we're going to try one more from Find a Match. Number 12. So if you'd like to pause and try it first on your own. Okay, I'm going to build my wall. Now when I ask myself what's happening to n is being multiplied by -2, and it's being subtracted by 4. Now that might be hard to see the way it's written now. So one thing you could do is you could always rearrange the terms if you want to make it easier. So I'm going to take this term and this term. Remember, the sign in front of a term is part of that term. And I'm going to write them the other way around. So the -4 is now here, and the -2n is here. Now it's easier to see what's happening to n. It's being multiplied by -2 and subtracted by 4. So the opposite of subtracting by 4 is adding both sides, adding 4 to both sides. That cancels. So now I have -2n equals 64. And what's still happening to n? It's being multiplied by -2. The opposite of that is to divide by -2. And so my final answer is n equals -32. Going back to the front page of your stapled assignment, we're going to do B. And this is solving equations with brackets. Whenever you have brackets, the first thing you want to do is distribute into the brackets. So this 4 is going to get multiplied to both terms in the bracket. And same here, this -2, same thing. It's going to get multiplied into this bracket. So I'll put my wall, And now I have 4x minus 12 equals 4x minus 2x minus 2. Now I'm going to look for any like terms on each side. On the left side, I don't have any like terms because this term has an x and this term doesn't. On the right side, I do have like terms, 4x and minus 2x. So 4x minus 2x simply equals 2x. And I still have the subtract 2 there, and this side's still the same as it was before. Now notice I have variables on both sides of the equation, and I want to get them to the same side. So on the right side here, I have plus 2x, and I think what's the opposite of plus 2x? The opposite of adding 2x is to subtract 2x, so I'm going to do that to both sides of the equation. And so 2x minus 2x is 0. And on the left side, 4x minus 2x is 2x. So now I have 2x minus 12 equals negative 2. Now I ask what's happening to x. It's being multiplied by 2 and subtracted by 12. The opposite of subtracting by 12 is adding 12. So I'm going to add 12 to both sides. So I now have 2x equals 10. And then x is still being multiplied by 2, and the opposite of multiplying by 2 is to divide both sides by 2. And so my final answer is x equals 5. So if you flip your assignment over, you'll see a couple of practice questions where you have equations involving brackets. Moving to the part C on the sheet, solving a Pythagoras. So Pythagoras, you need a right triangle, and you must know 2 of the sides. And if you have a right triangle and you know 2 of the sides, you can use Pythagoras to find the third side. One thing you always want to recognize in the right triangle is where is the hypotenuse. The hypotenuse is always the longest side of the triangle, and it's always directly across from the right angle. So this is my hypotenuse here. And that is always C in Pythagoras' theorem. So 5 is going to go right there for C. The other 2 sides of the right triangle are called the legs, and they are A and B, and it doesn't necessarily matter which is which. So I'm going to call this A and this B. So I have A squared plus B squared, which is actually 3, equals C squared. So now I'm going to square my numbers. 3 times 3 is 9. 5 times 5 is 25. And then I ask what's happening to A. It's being squared, and it's being added by 9. The opposite of adding 9 is to subtract 9 to both sides. So now I have A squared equals 16. And then what's happening to A still? It's being squared. What's the opposite of squaring? Square rooting. So I'm going to square root both sides. The square and the square root cancel each other, leaving me with just A. And the square root of 16 is 4. So my missing side is 4. There's some Pythagoras practice on the back side of this sheet. Moving on, these look a little more complicated, but they're really going to help you when we start chapter 1 very shortly in class. Here I have to solve for h. Notice it's the only unknown. I know what pi is. It's 3.1415926, blah, 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 right? And I know what pi is here. The only unknown in my equation is h. So what I want to do is isolate h and find out what it's going to be. So first thing is, make my wall. I still have 125 on this side. I want to do BEDMAS, so I want to do exponents first. So 4.5 squared. And then I want to multiply that by pi. So on my calculator, I do 4.5 squared, and then I multiply by pi, and I get 63.617. And then over here, I want to multiply pi and 4.5. And when I do that, I get 14.13. And that's still multiplied by h. Now I'm going to ask myself what's happening to h. Well, it's being multiplied by 14.13, and it's being added to 63.617. If you're having trouble seeing that, what you want to do is make your term trays and then flip them around. So let's just do that. I'm going to write this term first and this term second. And now it's a lot more clearly that h is being multiplied by 14.13 and being added by 63.617. Now remember, when you're trying to isolate a variable, you want to do reverse BEDMAS. So I first want to subtract by 63.617 to both sides. And I end up with 61.383 equals 14.13h. And then what's still happening to h? It's being multiplied by 14.13, and the opposite of that is to divide by 14.13. And this is my last step because I now know that h is going to be 4.3 if I round it to the nearest tenth. And so there's my final answer. So you'll be doing some math like that in the first chapter coming up soon. Last example. Here we need to solve for r. It's the only unknown. So right now we got to ask what's happening to r. It's being cubed, it's being multiplied by pi, and it's being multiplied to 4 over 3. One thing I recommend is rewriting this a little bit differently to start. I'm going to put this over 1 and make it a fraction. Pi r cubed over 1. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to think about multiplying these two fractions together. So if I multiply the tops, here's the top and the top here. When you multiply fractions and you multiply the tops, and then you multiply the bottoms, 3 times 1 is 3. So there's another way to write the same formula. Now I think, what's happening to r? It's being cubed, it's being multiplied by 4 pi, and it's being divided by 3. So the first thing I'm going to do is the opposite of dividing by 3. I'm going to multiply both sides by 3. So I'm going to multiply by 3 here, and I'm going to multiply by 3 here. The 3's here cancel. And then on the left side, I'm going to have 3 times 142.6, which is 427.8, and that equals 4 pi r cubed. Then I think what's still happening to r? Well, it's being multiplied by 4 pi, and the opposite of multiplying by 4 pi is to divide by 4 pi. So I'm going to divide both sides by 4 pi, and that's going to give me 34.04. And now all I have left on the right side is r cubed. So now the last thing I got to think is, what's the opposite of cubing? Well, the opposite of cubing is to cube root. And on your calculator, it might look something like this, or maybe like this, your calculator button. If you're having trouble cube rooting on your calculator, you can always ask in class. But what I got to do is I got to cube root both sides. Now here on the right, the cube root takes away the cube, leaving me with simply r. And then over here, if I cube root 34.04, I'll get my final answer, which is 3.24. So the radius is 3.24. So that concludes the tutorial. What you can do now is try to complete some of the questions on the rest of the stapled package and see how that goes.